Hello friends and history buffs, how are you? I hope everything is going well. Today, we're traveling to the heart of medieval Germany, to those eerie lands where the creak of iron armor echoes off stone walls and people still believe giants live in the forests. If you found this fascinating and dark historical journey interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, thinking about the massive cathedrals of that era, I'm curious, which architectural structure impresses you the most? I always enjoy reading your comments. Let us travel back to a time when magic still lived in the forests. Picture this. A young warrior becomes an emperor crowned by God himself. Monks huddle over glowing manuscripts in cold stone chambers. Village girls dance around harvest fires while their fathers sharpen swords for distant wars. Great lords feast in torch-lit halls. Their children will build castles that touch the clouds. Tonight you'll drift through 1,000 years of dreams and ambitions. You'll hear the clash of steel, the whisper of prayers, the laughter of children playing in cathedral shadows. This is medieval Germany, where every crown was earned in blood and every prayer carried the weight of eternity. The year is 476. The last Roman emperor in the West has fallen. But this isn't just the end of an empire. It's the beginning of something entirely new. Picture the Rhine frontier on a foggy morning. For centuries, Roman legions had stood guard here. Their bronze eagles gleamed in the sun. Their sandal feet had marched these roads for 400 years. Now those roads lay empty. Weeds pushed through the stone. The great military camps stood abandoned. The Germanic tribes watched from their forests. They had waited so long. The Alemanni in the southwest, the Bavarians in the Alpine valleys, the Saxons in the northern marshlands, the Thuringians in the central hills, and the Franks, perhaps the most ambitious of all, spreading across the western Rhine. These weren't barbarians, despite what Roman writers claimed. They were farmers and warriors, craftsmen and poets. They had their own gods, their own laws, their own dreams. They had simply been waiting for Rome to grow weak enough. The vacuum came faster than anyone expected. Roman cities that had bustled with merchants now echoed with emptiness. Cologne's forums fell silent. Trier's great basilica cracked in the winter frost. Nature began its patient work of reclamation. Vines crawled over marble walls. Deer grazed in abandoned amphitheaters. But the Germanic peoples didn't destroy these places out of hatred. Many moved in carefully, reverently. They understood that something great had lived here. They wanted to learn from it, to build upon it. Christian missionaries had been slipping across the frontier for decades. These brave souls carried more than just holy books. They brought literacy, new farming techniques, and most importantly, a vision of unity that transcended tribal boundaries. A Saxon could become brother to a Frank if both knelt before the same God. The old world was dying in whispers. The new world would be born in songs around Germanic fires, where warriors recited genealogies that stretched back to mythical heroes, and where Christian priests learned to speak of Christ in the language of ancient sagas. Enter Clovis, a Frankish king who understood the future better than his contemporaries. This wasn't a man content to raid Roman settlements. He wanted to inherit Rome's power, not just its gold. Clovis made the decision that would reshape Europe. On Christmas Day, around 496, he bent his knee in a Roman basilica and let Christian holy water pour over his warrior's head. His 3,000 followers did the same. In that moment, the Frankish kingdom became something unprecedented. A a Germanic tribe with Roman legitimacy and Christian divine favor. The eastward expansion began almost immediately, not as conquest, but as a kind of magnetic attraction. Germanic tribes looked at what Clovis had built and wanted to join it. The political implications rippled across the landscape like stones thrown into a still pond. Duchies began to emerge. Bavaria in the south, with its mountain passes and alpine meadows. Swabia in the southwest, where Roman influence remained strongest. Franconia in the center, becoming a bridge between different worlds. Saxony in the north, wild and proud, and not yet ready to bow to any king. The monks came in their wake. Saint Boniface would later be called the Apostle to the Germans, but he wasn't the first. Irish missionaries had been walking these forest paths for decades, carrying illuminated manuscripts in leather satchels, establishing monasteries in clearings that had once held pagan temples. These weren't just religious establishments. Monasteries became centers of learning, healing, and technological innovation. Monks developed better plows, improved the breeding of livestock, and most crucially began the patient work of clearing the great forests that still covered most of Germania. Local strongmen emerged from this transformation, not quite kings, but more than tribal chiefs. They built the first wooden halls that would evolve into stone castles. They gathered warrior followers who would become knights. They established the personal bonds of loyalty that would flower into the feudal system. Christianity didn't replace Germanic culture. It transformed it. Thor's hammer became the cross, but the courage it represented remained the same. The old stories of heroes facing monsters became tales of saints battling demons. The Germanic love of loyalty, honor, and generosity found new expression in Christian virtue. Imagine sitting in a tribal council meeting around 550. The chieftain still wears his gold arm rings. Warriors still carry their ancestral spears. But now there's a Christian priest sitting beside the chief. Now they're debating not just whether to raid the neighboring tribe, but whether such a raid would be pleasing to God. This was the transformation happening across Germania. Tribal councils were evolving into ducal courts. The rough democracy of Germanic assemblies was giving way to more structured hierarchy, but slowly, Roman legal traditions began blending with Germanic customs in fascinating ways. Romans believed in written law, universal and unchanging. Germans believed in personal law, varying by tribe and circumstance. The fusion created something entirely new. Written codes that respected local traditions, laws that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining stability. The Salic law of the Franks became a model. It prescribed exact penalties for specific crimes. Steal a pig, pay this much. Kill a man, pay that much to his family. But it also allowed for tribal variations, for the input of local assemblies, for the judgment of peers who understood local circumstances. Agriculture was being revolutionized. The three-field system, possibly developed in Frankish monasteries, would feed the population explosion to come. Instead of letting half the land leo, farmers could now use 2/3 productively. One field for spring crops, one for autumn plantings, one resting. It sounds simple, but it would enable medieval civilization. Trade routes began to hum with new activity. The Rhine remained the great highway, but now Germanic merchants joined Roman and Byzantine traders. They carried amber from the Baltic, furs from the northern forests, silver from primitive mines. In return came wine, silk, spices, and most importantly, ideas. Languages were evolving too. Latin remained the tongue of church and administration. But in the markets, in the fields, in the halls where warriors gathered, new forms of speech were emerging. Old High German in the south, Old Saxon in the north, variants and dialects that would eventually unite into a common tongue. Women's roles were shifting subtly but significantly. Germanic tradition had always respected women more than Roman law did. Now, Christian ideals of female holiness were mixing with Germanic concepts of female strength. Abbesses would soon rule territories like temporal princes. Queen mothers would guide kingdoms. The cult of the Virgin Mary would blend perfectly with older Germanic reverence for wise women and prophetic mothers. The Merovingian kings had grown weak. They sat on thrones while their mayors of the palace held real power. It was an arrangement that couldn't last forever. Someone with vision and ambition was bound to seize control directly. Charles Martel had stopped the Islamic advance at His son Pepe, had taken the crown with papal blessing. But it was Pep's son Charles who had become legend. Charles the Great Charlemagne. Picture a man nearly 7 trillion tall, with bright eyes and a commanding voice. He could read Latin, but preferred to dictate. He loved to swim and hunt. He ate simply, but thought grandly. Most importantly, he looked at the map of Europe and saw not what was, but what could be. The Saxon Wars began almost immediately after his coronation. This wasn't just conquest. This was a civilizational project that would take 33 years to complete. The Saxons lived in the marshy lands beyond the Weser River. They were everything the Franks had once been. Fierce, independent, pagan, organized in loose tribal confederations. They raided Christian settlements. They offered sacrifices to Woden at sacred groves. They represented the old world that Charlemagne was determined to transform. The Minsel stood in their holier sanctuary, a great wooden pillar that connected earth to sky, supporting the entire cosmos according to Saxon belief. When Charlemagne destroyed it in 772, he wasn't just making a military statement. He was declaring that the old gods were dead, that a new order would rise from their ashes. Wittgenstein emerged as the Saxon leader, a warrior poet who understood that this war was about more than territory. It was about the soul of Germania. He fought with desperate brilliance, using guerrilla tactics, melting away into forests and marshes when Frankish armies approached, striking back when they withdrew. The war became a cycle of seeming victory and renewed rebellion. Charlemagne would defeat the Saxons, force them to accept baptism, install Frankish administrators. Then he'd march away to fight in Italy or Spain, and the Saxons would rise again, burning churches, killing priests, reverting to their ancient ways. The turning point came in 782 at Verdun. Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners. It was brutal, even by medieval standards. The massacre shocked Europe, but it also broke something in Saxon resistance. Wittekhen himself surrendered 3 years later, accepting baptism at Aini. The forced Christianization that followed was systematic and thorough. Pagan practices became capital crimes. Christian churches replaced sacred groves. Saxon children were taken hostage to ensure their parents' compliance. It was cultural genocide dressed in religious clothing. Yet something remarkable happened in the aftermath. Within a generation, the Saxons had become some of the most devoted Christians in Europe. Their fierce loyalty, once given to Woden, now belonged to Christ. Their warrior culture found new expression in crusading ideals. They would produce some of the greatest saints, scholars, and emperors of the medieval period. Rome on Christmas Day, 800. Charlemagne knelt in prayer at St. Peter's tomb. He claimed later that he had no idea what Pope Leo III was planning. The papal crown settled on his head like destiny made manifest. Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans. The words echoed through the basilica. The Western Roman Empire, dead for over 3 centuries, lived again. But this wasn't really a Roman Empire. This was something new. A Germanic kingdom with imperial pretensions. A Christian commonwealth with barbarian energy. A fusion of traditions that would define European civilization for the next 1,000 years. Charlemagne's administrative system reflected this fusion perfectly. The Missi Domini, his traveling inspectors, combined Roman efficiency with Germanic personal loyalty. They carried written capitular law codes that could be applied universally. But they also held assemblies where local voices could be heard, where Germanic traditions of consultation could be maintained. The Palatine School at Aachen became the intellectual heart of the empire. Here, Alcuin of York gathered the greatest minds of the age. They didn't just preserve classical learning, they transformed it, blending Christian theology with pagan philosophy, Germanic poetry with Latin prose. Aachen itself rose like a dream from the Rhineland forests. Charlemagne's palace chapel still stands today, its Byzantine-inspired dome a testament to imperial ambitions. This was meant to be a new Rome, a northern capital that could rival Constantinople in splendor. The court culture that developed here would influence European aristocracy for centuries. Here Germanic warriors learned Roman manners. Here Christian scholars debated Aristotelian logic. Here the ideals of chivalry began their long development from crude tribal honor codes to sophisticated systems of courtly behavior. Charlemagne himself embodied these contradictions. He maintained a harem like a pagan chieftain, but attended Mass daily like a devout Christian. He could barely write his own name, but surrounded himself with the greatest scholars of the age. He lived simply, but built monuments to rival the Caesars. The empire at its peak stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to Rome. It included most of modern France, Germany and Italy, plus parts of Spain, Austria and the Low Countries. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Western Europe was politically united under a single ruler. The eastern frontier demanded special attention. Beyond the Elbe lay Slavic peoples who had never known Roman rule. They were organized in tribes much like the early Germans, but they remained largely pagan. They represented both opportunity and threat. Charlemagne's solution was the march system. Military frontier districts ruled by specially appointed margraves who combined civil and military authority. The Omark, which would become Austria, guarded the approaches to Bavaria. The Northern March protected Saxon settlements. The Sorbian March contained the Slavic winds. These weren't just military installations. They were civilizational beachheads. Each march centered on a fortified town with a cathedral, a palace, and a market. Christian missionaries worked alongside soldiers. Merchants followed in the wake of armies. Bishops became the administrative backbone of the system. Bishops weren't just spiritual leaders in Charlemagne's empire. They were temporal rulers, tax collectors, judges, and military commanders. They controlled vast estates worked by serfs and slaves. They commanded their own armies. This fusion of spiritual and temporal authority would define the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. It created immense power, but also inevitable conflicts. What happened when papal policy conflicted with imperial needs? What happened when bishops chose Rome over Aachen? Monastic reform accompanied territorial expansion. Charlemagne imposed the rule of Saint Benedict on all monasteries in his empire. This wasn't just administrative tidiness. It was cultural transformation. Benedictine monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation, manuscript copying, and technological development. The Capitulatio de Partus Saxoniae revealed the scope of Charlemagne's ambitions. This wasn't just law. It was social engineering on a massive scale. Pagan practices punishable by death. Church attendance mandatory. Tithes strictly enforced. The old Saxon society was to be dismantled completely and rebuilt according to Christian Frankish principles. Yet even here Germanic traditions influenced the process. The Capitulary recognized local assemblies. It preserved some Saxon legal customs. It allowed for gradual integration rather than immediate transformer. Bishoprics became the administrative backbone of the system. Bishops weren't just spiritual leaders in Charlemagne's empire. They were temporal rulers, tax collectors, judges, and military commanders. They controlled vast estates, worked by serfs and slaves. They commanded their own armies. This fusion of spiritual and temporal authority would define the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. It created immense power, but also inevitable conflicts. What happened when papal policy conflicted with imperial needs? What happened when bishops chose Rome over Aachen? Monastic reform accompanied territorial expansion. Charlemagne imposed the rule of St. Benedict on all monasteries in his empire. This wasn't just administrative tidiness. It was cultural transformation. Benedictine monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation, manuscript copying, and technological development. The Capitulary Saxoniae revealed the scope of Charlemagne's ambitions. This wasn't just law. It was social engineering on a massive scale. Pagan practices punishable by death. Church attendance mandatory. Tithes strictly enforced. The old Saxon society was to be dismantled completely and rebuilt according to Christian Frankish principles. And the Iron Hand wore a velvet glove, at least for those who submitted peacefully. The Palatine School wasn't just an educational institution. It was a cultural revolution. Alcuin of York brought the best of Irish and Anglo-Saxon learning to the continent. Students came from across Europe to study grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But they did more than study. They created the Carolinian minuscule, developed in Charlemagne's scriptorum, became the standard script for medieval Europe. It was clear, elegant, efficient. Modern printed letters derived directly from this 8th century innovation. Manuscript production exploded. Monasteries across the empire competed to create the most beautiful, most accurate copies of classical and Christian texts. We owe the preservation of countless ancient works to Carolingian scribes who labored by candlelight, copying Virgil and Augustine with equal devotion. Architecture reached new heights. Aachen Cathedral combined Germanic and Byzantine elements into something entirely original. The western facade with its massive towers and entrance portal established the template for Romanesque churches. Lorshaby's gatehouse, still standing today, showed how classical Roman forms could be adapted to Christian purposes. The scholars weren't just copying the past. They were creating new synthesis. Alcuin's commentaries on scripture blended patristic theology with contemporary insights. Einhard's Life of Charlemagne established the biographical tradition that would flourish in medieval history. The court poets experimented with both Latin verse and Germanica literative poetry. Most importantly, education began to spread beyond the palace. Cathedral schools were established in every major town. Parish priests were required to maintain basic literacy. The laity, especially the nobility, began to see education as necessary rather than merely ornamental. This wasn't yet a popular renaissance. Learning remained concentrated among the clergy and the highest nobility, but the foundations were being laid for the intellectual flowering that would come in later centuries. Even Charlemagne knew his creation was too vast to survive intact. Germanic tradition demanded division among sons. Christian universalism argued for unity. Roman precedent offered examples of both solutions. The first divisions came during lifetime, sub-kingdoms for his sons who would rule under imperial oversight. But death disrupted all careful planning. Louis the Pious inherited the entire empire in 814, but he lacked his father's commanding presence. The civil wars that followed were devastating. Brothers fought brothers. The empire that had taken decades to build seemed ready to collapse in a few years. The aristocracy chose sides based on personal advantage rather than principle. The church split between competing claimants. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 finally brought peace, but at a price. The empire was divided into three parts. Charles the Bold received the western portion, essentially modern France. Law kept the imperial title and the Middle Kingdom stretching from the North Sea to Italy. Louis the German received the eastern territories, the heart of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. This division created the fundamental political geography of medieval Europe. The Western Kingdom would become France. The Eastern Kingdom would become Germany. The Middle Kingdom would be fought over for centuries, its territories eventually absorbed by its stronger neighbors. Louis the German proved to be a capable ruler of the Eastern territories. He understood that his kingdom needed to develop its own identity, separate from both Frankish tradition and imperial pretension. He encouraged the use of Germanic vernacular in administration. He patronized Germanic literature and law. The gradual drift away from Frankish dominance accelerated under Louis's rule. The Eastern Kingdom began to look east rather than west. Trade with Byzantium increased. Missionary activity among the Slavs expanded. The foundations of the Drang Osten, the drive toward the east, were being laid. Local dukes asserted greater autonomy as central authority weakened. The tribal duchies that Charlemagne had tried to eliminate began to reconstitute themselves. Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Saxony emerged as semi-independent territories, owing nominal allegiance to the king, but ruling their own affairs. This decentralization wasn't necessarily weakness. It allowed for local adaptation for the development of regional identities that would enrich German culture. The dukes who emerged weren't just warlords. They were patrons of learning, founders of monasteries, builders of the first stone castles. The stage was set for the next act in the German drama. The Carolingian Empire had planted the seeds of medieval civilization. Now those seeds would grow in their own directions, creating new forms of government, new expressions of culture, new dreams of empire that would reshape the map of Europe once again. The year 1024 brought change like a spring flood. Hinrich the Had died without an heir. The great Etonian line, which had ruled for over a century, came to its end. But Germany had learned something precious from the Etonians. The crown belonged not to bloodlines, but to the worthiest man. The great lords gathered at Camber on the Rhine. Picture them in their finest robes. These dukes and counts and bishops who held the future of an empire in their hands. They chose Conrad, a relatively minor noble from the Salon house. He had royal blood, but distantly. What he possessed was something more valuable: vision. Conrad II understood that empires weren't built by accident. They required system, structure, the patient work of administration. His coronation at Mies was magnificent, But the real work began afterward in the quiet halls where clerks copied documents and judges heard cases. The kingdom of Burgundy fell into his hands like ripe fruit. This wasn't conquest. This was inheritance, diplomacy, the patient accumulation of legal claims. Burgundy stretched from the Alps to the Mediterranean, controlling the vital trade routes between Italy and northern Europe. With its acquisition, the Holy Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, but territory meant nothing without the means to govern it. Conrad's genius lay in recognizing a new class of men emerging across his realm, Legally, they were unfree. Socially, they were becoming indispensable. These weren't peasants or common serfs. These were trained administrators, skilled knights, capable managers, who owed everything to the crown. Because they had no hereditary lands, they remained loyal. Because they were unfree, they could be moved wherever needed. They became the backbone of imperial administration. The great noble families watched this development with growing unease. Their sons had expected to inherit positions at court, commands in the army, administration of royal estates. Now they found themselves competing with men of humble birth, who possessed nothing but talent and unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Conrad's reforms strengthened royal power in ways both obvious and subtle. Royal estates were managed more efficiently. Justice was administered more consistently. The emperor's word carried to the furthest corners of his realm, through a network of servants who owed their positions entirely to his favor. The old tribal duchies still existed, but their power was being quietly eroded. Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, these ancient names still commanded respect, but real authority was flowing toward the crown through channels that bypassed traditional aristocratic power. Conrad's son, Henry III, inherited more than a crown. He inherited a system, a vision, and most importantly, the confidence that imperial power could reshape the world according to God's will. Henry looked south toward Rome and saw corruption that offended both his piety and his sense of order. 3 men claimed to be pope. 3 different factions in the Holy City supported 3 different candidates. The papacy, which should have been the spiritual heart of Christendom, had become a prize fought over by Roman noble families. The Synod of Sutri in 1046 would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in medieval history. Henry descended into Italy not as a conqueror but as a reformer armed with imperial authority. He deposed all 3 rival popes with a stroke of a pen. The assembled clergy, cowed by imperial power, accepted his decision without protest. But Henry didn't stop there. He appointed German popes, men of unquestioned piety and learning. Clemente, Damascus, Leon. These were reformers who shared Henry's vision of a purified church serving God rather than earthly ambition. The church reform movement that followed transformed medieval Christianity. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was ruthlessly suppressed. Clerical marriage, long tolerated in practice, was forbidden. Monasteries that had grown lax were returned to strict observance of their rules. Back in Germany, prosperity flowed like honey in summer. Silver mines in the Harz Mountains produced unprecedented wealth. Trade routes hummed with activity. New towns sprouted around royal castles and episcopal seats. The population was growing. Forests were being cleared. Marshlands drained and settled. Henry's court became a center of learning that rivaled Charlemagne's palace school. Scholars came from across Europe to debate theology and philosophy. Artists created manuscripts of breathtaking beauty. Architects experimented with new forms that would evolve into the Romanesque style. Territorial expansion continued along the eastern frontier. The Slavic tribes beyond the Elbe were gradually being converted and incorporated into the imperial system. New bishops were established. German colonists moved eastward, bringing Christianity, agricultural innovations, and imperial authority. This was the high tide of imperial power. Never before had a Holy Roman Emperor wielded such influence over both temporal and spiritual affairs. Henry appointed popes and deposed them. He summoned bishops and they came running. He spoke and kingdoms trembled. But power at such heights carries the seeds of its own destruction. The very success of imperial authority was creating forces that would eventually challenge it. The reformed papacy that Henry had created would soon claim independence from imperial control. The efficient administration he had built would survive his dynasty's fall and serve new masters. Henry IV inherited the throne as a child. Regencies are always dangerous, but this one proved catastrophic. While the young king hunted in the forest of Goslar, the foundations of imperial power were quietly crumbling. The reform movement that Henry III had unleashed was developing a logic of its own. Pope Gregory II, born Hildebrand, had served the German popes faithfully. But he had also absorbed ideas that would have shocked his imperial patrons. Gregory believed that spiritual authority came directly from God, not through imperial appointment. He believed that the church should be free from lay control. Most dangerously, he believed that popes could depose emperors just as easily as emperors had deposed popes. The conflict began over something seemingly minor. Who had the right to invest bishops with the symbols of their office, the ring and staff that marked their spiritual authority? Henry IV claimed this right by ancient custom. Gregory II declared it an intolerable usurpation of papal prerogatives, but this wasn't really about rings and staffs. This was about the fundamental nature of power in medieval Europe. Was the emperor God's chosen representative on earth, ruling church and state alike? Or was he merely a temporal ruler, subject to spiritual authority in matters of faith and morals? The confrontation escalated with breathtaking speed. Gregory excommunicated Henry. Henry declared Gregory deposed. The German nobility, sensing weakness, began to waver in their loyalty. Some openly supported the Pope against their king. Then winter of 1077, Henry IV, abandoned by his supporters, made the desperate journey across the Alps. He stood for 3 days in the snow outside the castle where Gregory was staying. Barefoot, dressed as a penitent, the Holy Roman Emperor begged forgiveness from the man he had declared a false pope. The image burned itself into medieval consciousness. The most powerful ruler in Europe humbled before spiritual authority. Gregory, bound by his priestly duty to forgive the penitent, had no choice but to grant absolution. But Cosa solved nothing. Henry had saved his throne, but at the cost of imperial dignity. Gregory had demonstrated papal power, but had also shown that political calculation could override spiritual principle. The conflict would continue for decades. The Great Saxon Revolt of 1073 began as a regional uprising, but quickly became a symbol of resistance to royal tyranny. The Saxons had never forgotten their independence. They remembered Charlemagne's brutality, the destruction of the Mansell, the forced conversions that had brought them into the Christian fold. Henry Eve's castle-building program had pushed them too far. The Harzburg, his great fortress overlooking the silver mines, seemed to mock Saxon freedom. When they rose in rebellion, they struck at the symbol first. The castle was torn down stone by stone. The royal chapel was desecrated, Even the graves of Henry's family were violated. The irony was bitter. Henry had achieved everything his father had possessed: imperial crown, control over the papacy, recognition of his authority. But it was hollow victory. The moral authority of the empire had been shattered. The alliance between throne and altar, which had been the foundation of Etonian and early Salon power, lay in ruins. The son who rebelled against his father in 1105 understood something that Henry, I thought, never grasped. The old system was dead. Imperial power needed new foundations if it was to survive. Henry V was a realist in an age that still believed in absolutes. He recognized that the investiture controversy couldn't be won by either side. The empire needed the church, but the church would never again accept complete imperial dominance. Some compromise had to be found. The Unconcordant of Worms in 1122 was masterwork of medieval diplomacy. On the surface, it seemed to give both sides what they claimed to want. The Pope would invest bishops with ring and staff, the symbols of spiritual authority. The Emperor would invest them with scepter and lands, the symbols of temporal power. But the real genius lay in the details. In Germany, imperial investiture would precede papal investiture. The Emperor would retain effective control over episcopal appointments. The Pope would dominate the Italian church hierarchy. This geographic division reflected political reality. Germany remained the heart of imperial power. Italy was becoming increasingly independent of German control. The Unconcordant acknowledged these facts while maintaining the fiction of universal authority. The distinction between temporal and spiritual powers, so carefully crafted at Worms, would influence European political thought for centuries. It established the principle that church and state, while allied, possess separate spheres of authority. Neither could claim complete dominance over the other. Papal authority emerged, strengthened from the controversy. The reform movement had achieved most of its goals. Simony was largely eliminated. Clerical marriage was forbidden. The Church had established its independence from lay control. Most importantly, the papacy demonstrated that it could humble even emperors. The transformation of the German Church was profound but subtle. German bishops were now appointed through papal confirmation, but imperial influence remained strong. Monasteries embraced reformed observances, but they continued to serve royal political needs. The old system survived, but within new constraints. Death came for Henry V in 1125, and with it came the end of the Salon line. The great noble families gathered once again to choose a king. But this time, the choice would unleash forces that would shape German politics for the next century and beyond. Two names dominated the discussion: Conrad of Stalin, Henry V's nephew, who represented continuity with Salon policy, and Lothair of Saplenburg, Duke of Saxony, who promised a new direction. The electors chose law, but their decision created more problems than it solved. The Welf-Staffer rivalry began in that moment. The Staffen family, descended from the Dukes of Swabia, possessed vast lands in the southwest. They controlled the Alpine passes into Italy. They had served the Salon emperors faithfully and expected their loyalty to be rewarded. The Welf family traced their power to different sources. They were Dukes of Bavaria and Saxony, controlling the eastern approaches to the empire. They possessed immense wealth from their silver mines and trade connections. Most importantly, they had married into every major noble family in Europe. Law III understood that his election was controversial. He spent much of his reign trying to heal the wounds to find some accommodation between the rival factions. But healing required compromises that neither side was prepared to make. Marriage alliances became weapons in this political warfare. The Welfs married their daughters to foreign princes seeking allies beyond German borders. The Stalin cultivated connections within the empire, building a network of lesser nobles who owed them personal loyalty. The Second Crusade provided temporary distraction from domestic quarrels. When Pope Eugene III called for a new expedition to the Holy Land, German nobles responded with enthusiasm. Here was a chance to win glory, to demonstrate piety, to escape from the poisonous atmosphere of imperial politics. Conrad III, who had finally secured the Stalin claim to the throne, led a massive German contingent eastward. The flower of German knighthood followed their king toward Jerusalem, dreaming of victories that would restore imperial prestige. But the Second Crusade became a disaster of unprecedented proportions. The German army was destroyed in Anatolia by Turkish forces. Conrad himself barely escaped with his life. The survivors who struggled home brought tales of incompetence, betrayal, and divine displeasure. Conrad's election in 1138 was both triumph and tragedy. The Staufen had finally achieved the crown they believed was rightfully theirs, but they inherited an empire torn by civil war and diminished by crusading failures. The conflict with Henry the Proud, the Welf duke who controlled both Bavaria and Saxony, began almost immediately. Conrad declared that no man should hold to duchy. Henry must choose between them. Henry's refusal meant war. The siege of Vinniesburg in 1140 became legend before the smoke had cleared from its walls. When it finally fell, the king granted a remarkable mercy. The women could leave with whatever they could carry on their backs. The women emerged carrying their husbands and fathers and sons. Conrad's knights prepared to protest this obvious trickery, but the king stopped them with a gesture. A royal word once given cannot be taken back, he declared. The scene would be remembered as the epitome of medieval chivalry. More importantly for political history, the siege gave birth to the party names that would dominate German politics for generations. The staff and supporters began calling themselves Waibling after one of their family castles. The Welf supporters proudly adopted their family name. In Italy, these would become Ghibellines and Gs, the faction names that would tear the peninsula apart. The failed Second Crusade haunted Conrad's later reign. He had led the greatest army Germany had ever assembled to complete destruction. Thousands of knights lay buried in Anatolian soil. The survivors returned home bitter and impoverished. The king's reputation never recovered. But Conrad achieved something more lasting than military glory. He established Stahler power in Swabia beyond any challenge. He built the administrative structure that would support his successors. Most importantly, he arranged for his nephew Frederick to inherit not just the throne, but the vision of imperial greatness that would define the next century. Frederick Thorn came to the throne in 1152, carrying the hopes of a generation. Tall, red-bearded, magnificent in bearing. He looked like kingship personified. But his true greatness lay not in appearance, but in his ability to balance conflicting forces that had torn Germany apart for decades. His election was itself a masterpiece of political compromise. The Welf faction supported him because his mother was a Welf princess. The Stalin faction claimed him as Conrad's chosen heir. Regional interests saw in him a king who understood local concerns. The church hierarchy found him acceptably pious without being fanatically reformist. But Frederick's greatest achievement was his Italian policy. Not the policy itself, which would ultimately fail, but the vision behind it. He looked across the Alps and saw not just rich cities to be plundered, but the key to universal empire that had eluded his predecessors. The Lombard League that formed against him included Milan, Venice, Genoa, and dozens of smaller cities. They had grown rich on Mediterranean trade. They had developed forms of government that made them effectively independent republics. They had no intention of submitting to German imperial authority. The war that followed lasted 20 years and consumed enormous resources. Frederick won brilliant victories. He captured Milan and leveled it to the ground. He appointed imperial administrators to govern Italian cities. He seemed on the verge of accomplishing what no emperor since Charlemagne had managed: the effective unification of Western Europe under German leadership. But the Battle of Legnano in 1176 shattered these dreams. The Lombard League, fighting for their independence, defeated the imperial army decisively. Frederick himself was thrown from his horse and nearly killed. The myth of imperial invincibility died in the mud of a northern Italian battlefield. The Peace of Constance in 1183 was Frederick's masterpiece of diplomatic realism. He recognized the independence of the Italian cities while maintaining the fiction of imperial overlordship. The cities acknowledged him as emperor while retaining the right to govern themselves. Neither side got everything they wanted, but both got enough to make peace worthwhile. Back in Germany, Frederick's reign saw the flowering of medieval culture at its most magnificent. His court at Hegenau became a center of learning and artistic achievement. His palace at Galhausen, with its soaring Romanesque architecture, embodied the confidence and ambition of the age. The court culture that developed around Frederick Barbarossa represented medieval civilization at its most refined. Here the crude warrior ethos of earlier centuries was transformed into something approaching art. The Minnesang tradition reached its pinnacle during these years. Poets like Walter van der Vogelweide created verses that captured the essence of courtly love, the idealized relationship between knight and lady that would influence European literature for centuries. But this wasn't just poetry for poetry's sake. The Minnesang reinforced social values that the emperor needed to promote: loyalty, honor, service, the sublimation of personal desire in favor of higher ideals. These weren't just literary themes. They were the psychological foundations of feudal society. The Arthurian romances found their German expression in this period. Wilhelm Vonenbach's Pivel told the story of the Grail Knight's spiritual journey. Gottfried von Strasbourg's Tristan explored the tragic conflict between love and duty. These weren't just entertainment. They were moral instruction disguised as adventure stories. The ideal of knighthood itself was being refined and codified. The knight wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was a Christian soldier bound by vows of service to God, Lord and Lady. He was expected to protect the weak, defend the church, and maintain justice even at the cost of his own life. The Peace of God movement, imported from France, found fertile ground in Germany. The church declared certain times and places off limits to warfare. Sundays and holy days became sanctified. Churches and monasteries became sanctuaries. Non-combatants, clergy, merchants, farmers were theoretically protected from the violence that was endemic to medieval society. These movements were attempting something unprecedented in human history: the taming of the warrior class through moral and cultural pressure. It worked partially and temporarily. The worst excesses of feudal warfare were reduced. The strong felt some obligation to protect the weak. The ideal of the Christian knight became a reality for at least some members of the military aristocracy. Frederick's son Henry V, Sixth inherited not just a throne but an opportunity. Through marriage to Constance of Sicily, he had a claim to the richest kingdom in medieval Europe. Through inheritance, he controlled the German Empire. Through ambition, he dreamed of uniting them into a power that would dominate the known world. The acquisition of Sicily transformed the political map of Europe. Suddenly, the Holy Roman Empire stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic approaches to the borders of Byzantium. No ruler since Charlemagne had commanded such vast territories. Sicily wasn't just territory. It was wealth beyond imagination. The kingdom controlled the Mediterranean trade routes. Its cities were centers of learning where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked together. Its administration was the most efficient in Europe. Its army included Muslim soldiers, Norman knights, and Greek bureaucrats. Henry's failed crusade in 1197 was perhaps the greatest missed opportunity in medieval history. He had assembled an army capable of retaking Jerusalem. He had the resources to maintain it indefinitely. He had the political authority to unite the fractured Crusader states under German leadership. But death intervened before his ships could sail. Henry died at Hamsina, victim of either malaria or poison. His grand vision died with him. The army dispersed. The opportunity passed to others. The capture of Richard Lionheart on his return from the Third Crusade showed both Henry's power and his pragmatism. The English king was technically under imperial protection, but Henry held him anyway, demanding an enormous ransom that would finance his other projects. Henry's plan for hereditary monarchy represented his most radical departure from German tradition. He wanted to make the crown hereditary in his family, eliminating the electoral process that had caused so much instability. The proposal split the German nobility. Some saw the wisdom of avoiding succession crisis. Others feared the end of their influence over royal policy. The vision of universal empire that Henry articulated was breathtaking in its scope. German power in the north, Sicilian wealth in the south, control of the Mediterranean trade routes, dominance over the Crusader states, eventual conquest of Byzantium itself. It was a dream worthy of Alexander or Caesar. But it was also impossible given medieval resources and communications. No single ruler, however capable, could effectively govern territories so vast and diverse. The attempt would have bankrupted even the richest kingdom. The failure would have been spectacular and probably fatal to German imperial ambitions. Henry V's sixth death in 1197 left his 3-year-old son, Frederick, as heir to Sicily and claimant to the German throne. A child king meant regency, faction fighting, and the collapse of everything Henry had built. The German princes faced an impossible choice: accept a child king under foreign influence or elect a new ruler and abandon the Stahler dynasty entirely. They chose division, electing Philip of Sabia, Henry's brother, while the papal party supported Otto of Brunswick, the wealth claimant. Otto's eventual triumph owed more to papal support than to German loyalty. Pope Innocent III, the most powerful pontiff of the medieval period, saw an opportunity to free the Church from imperial domination. A wealth emperor dependent on papal favor might be more tractable than the proud Sten dynasty. The conflict with Philip of Swabia tore Germany apart once again. Each claimant held separate courts, appointed separate officials, granted separate privileges. The careful administrative structure built by Frederick Barbarossa collapsed into competing bureaucracies serving rival masters. Philip's assassination in 1208 ended the civil war but solved nothing fundamental. Otto inherited a throne weakened by years of conflict. His authority was questioned by nobles who had supported his rival. His resources were depleted by the costs of war. The Battle of Louvain in 1214 destroyed more than an army. Otto's alliance with England against France was supposed to restore imperial prestige through military victory. Instead, the crushing defeat eliminated German influence in Western European politics for a generation. The collapse of wealth power was sudden and complete. Otto fled the battlefield at Louvain and never recovered his authority. The German princes, faced with a discredited king and a resurgent French monarchy, began looking for alternatives. Young Frederick II, now grown to manhood in his Sicilian kingdom, emerged as the obvious choice. Crowned by Pope Innocent III as a papal ward, he represented both continuity with Stafford tradition and accommodation with papal policy. Frederick II was called Wonder of the World even in his lifetime. King of Sicily at 3, German Emperor at 20. He would spend his life trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. German imperial tradition with Sicilian efficiency, medieval Christianity with classical learning, universal empire with practical politics. His Sicilian court at Palermo became the intellectual center of Europe. Here translations from Arabic introduced Aristotelian philosophy to the West. Here poets wrote in vernacular languages that would become modern Italian. Here natural philosophy, what we would call science, was pursued with systematic enthusiasm. Frederick's own intellectual curiosity was legendary. He spoke 9 languages fluently. He corresponded with Muslim scholars about mathematics and astronomy. He wrote a treatise on falconry that was also a work of natural observation. He patronized artists, philosophers, and scientists without regard to their religious background. But his greatest achievement was the efficient administration he created in Sicily. The constitutions of Meli established a legal code that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. The bureaucracy he developed was staffed by merit rather than birth. The tax system was rational and comprehensive. The conflict with Pope Gregory IX was inevitable given Frederick's character and ambitions. He had promised to lead a crusade, but delayed for years while consolidating his power. When he finally sailed to the Holy Land, he was under papal excommunication for his tardiness. The Sixth Crusade, conducted by an excommunicated emperor, was the most successful since the first. Frederick negotiated rather than fought, using diplomacy and bribery to recover Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. He crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Holy Sepulchre while under papal ban. The irony was perfect and bitter. The most intellectual of medieval emperors achieved through negotiation what his more pious predecessors had failed to accomplish through warfare. But he received no credit from the church he had served so effectively. Frederick's German policy was necessarily neglectful. Sicily demanded his attention. Italy required his presence. Germany was left to be governed by regents who lacked both authority and resources. The princes began asserting independence that would prove irreversible. Conrad the Thor inherited his father's ambitions, but not his genius. The young king spent his brief reign trying to hold together an empire that was already fragmenting beyond repair. The interregnum that followed Conrad's death in 1254 was both ending and beginning. The Holy Roman Empire, as a functioning political entity, effectively ceased to exist. But the German kingdoms and principalities that emerged from its wreckage would eventually create something new and perhaps stronger. Foreign kings claimed the imperial title. Alonso of Castile and Richard of Cornwall bought electoral votes and wore empty crowns. Neither possessed the resources to govern Germany. Neither commanded the respect necessary for effective leadership. Real power devolved to the territorial princes. the Duke of Austria, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Count Palatine of the Rhine. These men governed their territories independently while maintaining the fiction of imperial loyalty. Conradin's tragic attempt to reclaim his inheritance ended at Naples in 1268. The last Sta emperor, barely 16 years old, was captured and executed by Charles of Anjou. With his death, the dreams of universal empire that had driven German policy for 2 centuries died as well. The imperial fragmentation that followed was not entirely negative. Local rulers could respond more quickly to local needs. Regional cultures could develop their own distinctive characteristics. The Holy Roman Empire became less centralized, but perhaps more resilient. The cities that had grown during the imperial period continued to flourish under local rule. Trade networks expanded. Artistic and intellectual achievements multiplied. The Germanic lands entered a new phase of their development, one that would eventually produce the Germany we know today. The end of the Staeler dynasty marked the end of medieval Germany's imperial age. What followed would be different, more fragmented politically, but perhaps richer culturally. The dream of universal empire was dead, but the German people were very much alive, ready to write new chapters in their long and complex history. The German lands lay like a body without a head. For the first time in 4 centuries, no strong hand held the reins of empire. The great princes looked around and saw opportunity where others saw chaos. Richard of Cornwall bought his crown with English silver. The electors took his money and gave him a meaningless title. Alonso of Castile made grander promises from his distant Spanish throne. Both men called themselves Holy Roman Emperor. Neither could command a single German village. Picture the confusion of ordinary people during these years. Merchants didn't know whose coins to accept. Peasants didn't know which lord to obey. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites couldn't tell which safe conducts would protect them. The whole system of authority that had governed Europe for generations simply evaporated. But nature abhors a vacuum, especially in politics. Where imperial power retreated, regional powers advanced. The Duke of Austria began acting like an independent king. The Margrave of Brandenburg started issuing his own laws. The Duke of Bavaria married his children to foreign royalty as if he ruled a sovereign state. These weren't rebellions in the traditional sense. There was no emperor to rebel against. These were simply practical men filling the void left by imperial collapse. They collected taxes that had once gone to the crown. They dispensed justice that had once required imperial approval. They made war and peace as their interests demanded. The free imperial cities seized their chance for independence. Cologne, with its magnificent cathedral rising stone by stone toward heaven, declared itself answerable to no earthly lord save the emperor. And since there was no real emperor, Cologne governed itself. The merchants who controlled the city council weren't nobles born to command. They were practical men who understood that money could buy what birth had once provided. Augsburg in the south, controlling the Alpine passes into Italy, became a city-state to rival Venice. Its merchant princes built palaces that would have impressed Roman patricians. Its workshops produced goods that found their way to London and Constantinople. Nuremberg, strategically placed in the heart of Germany, became the empire's unofficial capital. Here, the imperial regalia was stored. Here, the traditional ceremonies continued even when no emperor existed to perform them. The city's craftsmen became famous across Europe for their precision and artistry. In the north, something even more remarkable was happening. The Hanseatic League was transforming the entire Baltic world through the simple power of organized commerce. Lübeck had begun as a modest trading post. Now it commanded a network of cities stretching from London to Novgorod, Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig, Bergen. These weren't just cities anymore. They were the capitals of a merchant empire that controlled the seas more effectively than any royal navy. The Hanseatic merchants developed their own laws, their own courts, their own diplomatic corps. They negotiated treaties with kings and fought wars against princes. Their ships carried not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations that would reshape Northern Europe. When the Danish king tried to impose his authority on Baltic trade, the Hanseatic League went to war. Their ships blockaded Danish ports. Their merchants organized boycotts that brought the royal government to its knees. The Treaty of Strelsen in 1370 would give the League powers that most kingdoms could only dream of. This was capitalism before the word existed. This was international cooperation before the concept had been invented. The German merchants of the Hanseatic League were creating new forms of power that didn't depend on noble birth or religious authority. The year 1273 brought hope like dawn after a long night. The German princes, exhausted by decades of anarchy, finally chose a new emperor. But their choice surprised everyone, including the man they selected. Rudolf of Habsburg was called the Poor Count by his enemies. His castle on the Rhine commanded respect in its immediate vicinity, but little beyond. His revenues were modest by royal standards. His military forces were adequate for local conflicts, but hardly impressive by imperial measure. But Rudolf possessed something more valuable than wealth or armies. He possessed judgment. He looked at the wreckage of the Holy Roman Empire and understood that the old dreams of universal dominion were finished. The future lay not in conquering Italy or commanding the Pope, but in consolidating real power over manageable territories. Ottokar of Bohemia had grown too powerful during the interregnum. He controlled Bohemia, Moravia, Austria, and much of Hungary. He commanded the richest silver mines in Europe. He dreamed of founding his own empire in the heart of Europe, an empire that would make the German crown irrelevant. The Battle of Marchfeld in 1278 settled the question with medieval finality. Ottar died on the field, his dreams of Bohemian Empire dying with him. Rudolf didn't just win a battle. He secured the foundation of Habsburg power that would dominate Central Europe for the next 600 years. Austria became Rudolf's great prize, not the sandy Moravia that Charlemagne had created, but a rich duchy controlling the Danube trade routes. The Privilegia Minus of 1156 had already granted Austria special status within the empire. Now the Habsburgs would make it the foundation of their family fortune. Rudolf's policy was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of chasing imperial phantoms in Italy, he focused on building real power in territories he could actually control. Instead of fighting the church over investiture rights he couldn't enforce, he cooperated with papal policy where it didn't conflict with Habsburg interests. The Italian cities that had resisted Frederick Barbarossa ignored Rudolf completely. They weren't being rebellious. They were simply acknowledging reality. The new emperor had neither the resources nor the inclination to enforce imperial authority south of the Alps. This wasn't weakness. This was strategic wisdom. Rudolf understood that effective power over a smaller area was more valuable than theoretical authority over vast territories. The Holy Roman Empire would never again be truly Roman, but it might survive as something uniquely German. Henry VII of Luxembourg revived the old dreams one last time. Crowned emperor in 1312, He looked south toward Italy and saw opportunity where wiser men saw only trouble. His Italian expedition was magnificent and doomed. He descended through the Alpine passes with an army worthy of the great emperors. Cities opened their gates to him. The Ghibelline faction, supporters of imperial authority, emerged from hiding to cheer his progress. Dante Alighieri himself hailed Henry as the savior who would restore order to Italy. The great poet's letters from this period burn with messianic fervor. Here at last was an emperor who would end the factional warfare that had torn the peninsula apart for generations. But Henry died at Bronto in 1313, possibly poisoned, certainly mourned. With his death, the last serious attempt at universal empire died, too. Future emperors would learn from his failure. Louis the Bavarian inherited Henry's crown, but not his Italian obsessions. Unfortunately, he inherited something worse. A fundamental conflict with the papacy that would define his entire reign. Pope John IX, ruling from Avignon under French influence, declared Louis's election invalid. The Pope claimed the right to approve or reject imperial elections. Louis naturally disagreed. The conflict escalated until all Europe was forced to choose sides. The intellectual battle that followed proved more significant than the political one. Marcellius of Padua and John of Jandun wrote the Defense of Passes, a revolutionary treatise on political authority. They argued that power came from the people, not from God through papal mediation. They claimed that emperors derived their authority from election by the German princes, not from papal confirmation. These ideas were dangerous to every established authority in Europe. If people were the ultimate source of political power, what need was there for divine right monarchy? If emperors didn't need papal approval, what claim did the Church have to temporal authority? Charles IV of Luxembourg, who became emperor in 1347, was too intelligent to repeat his predecessor's mistakes. He abandoned Italy entirely, focusing his energies on building a solid territorial base in Bohemia and the surrounding regions. The Golden Bull of 1356 was Charles's masterpiece, the constitutional document that would govern the Holy Roman Empire until its dissolution in 1806. It settled the electoral process once and for all, defining exactly who could choose the emperor and how that choice would be made. The Golden Bull created a new kind of empire unlike anything that had existed in European history. This wasn't the centralized monarchy that was developing in France and England. This wasn't the city-state system that characterized Italy. This was something entirely original. A federal system that balanced central authority with regional autonomy. 7 electors would choose the emperor. For secular princes, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. 3 ecclesiastical princes, the Archbishops of Mies, Cologne, and Trier. These 7 men would determine the fate of Central Europe. The electoral process was defined with legal precision. The electors would meet at Frankfurt and Main. They would vote by majority rule. Their choice would be final, requiring no confirmation from Pope or anyone else. The emperor would be crowned at Aachen, Charlemagne's ancient capital. Papal confirmation, which had caused so much trouble during the investiture controversy, was explicitly excluded. The emperor derived his authority from election by the German princes, not from papal blessing. The Church could object all it wanted. The constitutional framework ignored ecclesiastical approval entirely. The decentralized structure that emerged was complex but surprisingly effective. The emperor retained certain prerogatives: command of the imperial army, the right to grant fiefs, the authority to call imperial diets. But the territorial princes governed their own lands with minimal interference. This system suited German conditions perfectly. The Germanic tribes had never been comfortable with centralized authority. The territorial diversity of the empire made uniform administration nearly impossible. The federal solution allowed for local variation within an imperial framework. The Golden Bull also regularized the position of the free imperial cities. These urban communities owed allegiance directly to the emperor, not to any territorial prince. They could govern themselves according to their own laws. They could form leagues for mutual protection. They became islands of republican government in a feudal sea. The cities grew like flowers after rain. Where Roman settlements had crumbled, new communities rose around cathedrals and castles. Where trade routes intersected, markets became permanent fixtures that attracted craftsmen and merchants. Cologne remained the greatest city of medieval Germany. Its cathedral, begun in 1248, reached toward heaven with Gothic spires that could be seen for miles. Its merchants traded from London to Byzantium. Its universities attracted students from across Europe. Its population approached 50,000 souls, enormous by medieval standards. Augsburg, in the south, became the banking capital of Europe. The Fugger family, starting as humble weavers, built a financial empire that would eventually loan money to emperors and finance the election of Charles II. Their accounting methods were copied from Italian models, but adapted to German needs. The Welser family competed with the Fuggers for dominance in international finance. They funded trading expeditions to Venezuela and the East Indies. They treated with kings as equals. They demonstrated that birth meant less than brains in the new economic order. Nuremberg's craftsmen became legendary for their precision. The city's metalworkers produced armor for knights across Europe. Its clockmakers created timepieces of unprecedented accuracy. Its artists, led by Ulrich Dürer, would help define the Renaissance aesthetic. Lübeck ruled the Baltic through the Hanseatic League. From this modest city on the North Sea coast, merchants coordinated trade networks that stretched across northern Europe. Their ships carried grain from Poland, timber from Scandinavia, furs from Russia, and manufactured goods from Germany. The trade routes that connected these cities created Germany's economic backbone. The Rhine remained the great highway, but now it was joined by overland routes that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The Amber Road carried Baltic gold to Italian markets. The Salt Road brought Alpine salt to northern consumers. Banking developed to meet the needs of long-distance trade. Italian methods were imported and adapted. Letters of credit replaced bags of silver. Double-entry bookkeeping allowed for complex accounting. Interest rates were calculated to balance risk and profit. Guild systems governed urban economic life. These weren't just trade associations. They were mutual aid societies, political organizations, and cultural institutions. Master craftsmen controlled their trades jealously, but they also maintained quality standards and provided for widows and orphans. Urban government evolved to meet new needs. City councils replaced feudal lordship. Written law codes replaced personal justice. Professional administrators replaced amateur volunteers. The cities were creating new forms of governance that would influence political development for centuries. In the quiet valleys of Germany, behind walls of grey stone, a different kind of revolution was unfolding. The monasteries that dotted the landscape weren't just houses of prayer. They were centers of learning, agricultural innovation, and spiritual experimentation that would reshape European civilization. The Cluny reform movement swept across Germany like a spring flood. Starting from the great abbey of Cluny and Burgundy, reformers carried new ideas about monastic life into every corner of the Germanic lands. They demanded strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict. They insisted on independence from local noble control. They created a network of monasteries that owed allegiance only to the Pope. Hersau in the Black Forest became the German center of Cluny reform. Under Abbot William, it established over 100 daughter houses. These weren't just religious foundations. They were economic powerhouses that cleared forests, drained swamps, and introduced new agricultural techniques. The Cistercians brought an even more radical vision. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential monk of the 12th century, preached a return to primitive simplicity. Cistercian monasteries rejected the elaborate decorations that had become common. Their churches were austere, their lifestyle harsh, their dedication to manual labor absolute. Maulbronn, founded in 1147, became the model sister's house in Germany. Its monks developed new methods of water management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding. They established schools that taught both Latin learning and practical skills. They demonstrated that holiness and prosperity weren't mutually exclusive. But the most uniquely German contribution to monasticism was the military orders. The Teutonic Knights, founded during the Crusades, found their true mission not in the Holy Land, but on the Baltic frontier. The Northern Crusades transformed Eastern Europe under the banner of the Teutonic Order. German knights and colonists pushed eastward beyond the Ila. They conquered the pagan Prussians and Lithuanians. They established German settlements in lands that had never known Roman rule. Marienburg, the Order's capital, rose like a stone dream from the marshy plains of Prussia. Its massive walls enclosed not just a fortress, but a complete administrative center. From here, the Grand Masters ruled territories that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Franciscans and Dominicans brought a different kind of revolution. These mendicant friars didn't withdraw from the world. They embraced it, preaching in the streets, caring for the poor, challenging both secular and ecclesiastical authority. Meister Eckhart, the great Dominican mystic, taught that God could be found not just in churches and monasteries, but in the depths of the human soul. His sermons, preached in German rather than Latin, reached audiences that had never heard sophisticated theology before. The Franciscan spirituals challenged the growing wealth of the Church. They insisted that Christ's apostles had owned nothing, that the Church should return to evangelical poverty. Their ideas would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. Women found new opportunities in the religious revival. The Begu laywomen who lived in religious communities without taking formal vows created an alternative to traditional monasticism. They could serve God without surrendering their independence entirely. Hildegard of Bingen, perhaps the most remarkable woman of the medieval period, combined mystical visions with practical administration. She founded monasteries, wrote theological treatises, composed music, and practiced medicine. Her influence extended across Europe. The Cathedral of Cologne rose stone by stone, but something equally magnificent was rising in its shadow. The cathedral school that educated the clergy was evolving into something unprecedented. An institution of higher learning open to anyone with ability and ambition. The development of education followed the growth of urban civilization. Villages needed priests who could read the Mass and perform the sacraments. Cities needed clerks who could write letters and keep accounts. The royal administration needed lawyers who understood both canon and civil law. Cathedral schools met these needs initially. The cathedral chapter in each episcopal city maintained a school where young clerks learned grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. The curriculum was practical but limited. Students learned enough Latin to serve the church, enough law to handle routine cases. The arrival of scholasticism changed everything. When Aristotelian philosophy reached Germany through Islamic and Jewish translations, it challenged every assumption about knowledge and authority. How could pagan philosophy be reconciled with Christian faith? How could reason be balanced against revelation? Albertus Magnus, teaching in Cologne, wrestled with these questions. He was the first German scholar to engage seriously with Aristotelian natural philosophy. His student Thomas Aquinas would create the great synthesis of faith and reason that defined medieval theology. The University of Prague, founded by Charles IV in 1348, became the first university in the German-speaking world. It was modeled on the University of Paris with 4 faculties: arts, theology, law, and medicine. Students came from across Central Europe to study with masters who represented the cutting edge of medieval learning. The University of Vienna, established in 1365, catered to students from the southeastern regions of the empire. Its medical faculty became famous across Europe. Its law faculty trained the bureaucrats who would govern the Habsburg territories. Heidelberg University, founded in 1386, served the western regions. It became a center of humanist learning where classical texts were studied for their own sake rather than merely as aids to theology. The Renaissance was beginning to penetrate German intellectual life. The transmission of Aristotelian philosophy revolutionized German thought. The pagan philosophers' works on logic, ethics, politics, and natural science provided frameworks for understanding that went far beyond traditional Christian categories. But this wasn't simple adoption of ancient ideas. German scholars adapted Aristotelian concepts to medieval needs. They used his logical methods to analyze Christian doctrine. They applied his political theory to the problems of imperial government. They employed his natural philosophy to understand the created world. The universities weren't just educational institutions. They were centers of intellectual debate that influenced political and religious development. University-trained lawyers staffed royal administrations. University-educated clergy filled episcopal sees. University-trained physicians served noble courts. Most importantly, the universities created a new social class, the intellectuals. These men weren't born to power or wealth. They achieved influence through learning and ability. They owed their positions to merit rather than inheritance. In the great hall of Arin Castle, torches flicker against stone walls. A warrior poet rises to recite the deeds of heroes long dead. His voice carries across centuries, linking the Germanic tribes to their medieval descendants through the power of story. The Hildebrand slide, fragment of an ancient heroic poem, preserves the voice of Germanic antiquity. Father faces son in battle, neither recognizing the other until it's too late for reconciliation. The story captures the tragic essence of the warrior culture that shaped early German identity. But new stories were emerging to compete with the old. The courtly romances that flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries created new models of behavior, new ideals of love and honor that would influence European culture for centuries. Paravel Wolfenbach's masterpiece told the story of the perfect knight's spiritual journey. This wasn't just adventure fiction. It was moral instruction disguised as entertainment. Paravel's quest for the Grail became a metaphor for the soul's search for God. Gottfried von Strasber's Tristan explored darker themes. The love between Tristan and Isolde was both magnificent and destructive. It challenged social conventions, but also demonstrated their necessity. Passion, however pure, could destroy the very society that enabled it. The Ney and Lied Germany's national epic combined ancient Germanic heroic traditions with medieval courtly culture. Siegfried's adventures in the first part recalled the mythological world of gods and dragons. The Revenge of Kriemhild in the second part explored the consequences of uncontrolled emotion. These weren't just German stories. They were European phenomena translated and adapted across the continent. The Arthurian legends reached Germany through French sources but were transformed by German poets into something distinctively Germanic. The Minnesang tradition created Germany's contribution to courtly love poetry. Dutta von Dende, Vogelweide, the greatest of the Meininger, wrote verses that captured the essence of medieval romantic idealism. His songs of unrequited love became the soundtrack of courtly culture. But Walter also wrote political poetry that criticized imperial policy and ecclesiastical corruption. His verses could mock the Pope as easily as praise a lady's beauty. The Minnesangana weren't just court entertainers. They were social commentators whose opinions carried weight. Religious drama flourished in the growing cities. Mystery plays performed in cathedral squares brought biblical stories to life for audiences that couldn't read. The passion plays that developed during this period would continue to be performed into modern times. These dramatic performances weren't just entertainment. They were educational tools that taught Christian doctrine to largely illiterate populations. They were also community events that brought together all social classes in common celebration. The development of vernacular literature marked a cultural revolution. For the first time since the fall of Rome, serious literature was being written in languages. Other than Latin, German poets were creating works that could compete with classical models. The Cathedral of Speyer rises from the Rhine plain like a stone mountain. Its massive towers, its round arches, its thick walls speak of an age when builders thought in terms of centuries rather than years. This is Romanesque architecture at its most magnificent. Solid, confident, enduring. Speyer wasn't just a church. It was a political statement. Built by the Salon emperors as their burial place, it proclaimed imperial power in stone and mortar. The crypt beneath the high altar housed the remains of 8 Holy Roman emperors. The cathedral itself was meant to rival the greatest churches of Rome and Byzantium. Worms Cathedral, with its soaring towers at both ends, created a new architectural form that would influence church building across Europe. The double-ended basilica became the standard for imperial cathedrals, a design that emphasized both earthly and heavenly authority. But even as the Romanesque style reached its peak, new influences were arriving from France. The Gothic Revolution that began at Saint-Ouen spread rapidly to German cities that had the wealth and ambition to build in the new style. Cologne Cathedral, began in 1248, was designed to be the largest Gothic church in Northern Europe. Its choir, completed in 1322, demonstrated the full glory of the Gothic aesthetic. Walls that seemed to dissolve into windows, vaults that soared toward heaven, light that transformed stone into something approaching the divine. Strabo Cathedral's facade became a textbook of Gothic sculpture. The rose window, the portal figures, the intricate stonework demonstrated technical mastery that would be studied and imitated for centuries. The cathedral was both architectural achievement and artistic masterpiece. The Etonian and Stala scriptoria produced manuscript illumination of breathtaking beauty. The Gospel Book of Artois, with its jewel-like miniatures, showed how Germanic artistic traditions could be combined with Byzantine and Carolingian influences. The Codex men produced in Zurich around 1300 preserved the images of the great minister, along with their poetry. The miniatures show how medieval artists imagined the courtly culture they were depicting. Colorful, elaborate, idealized. Metalwork and goldsmithing reached heights of technical achievement that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. The archon treasures accumulated over centuries by emperors and bishops demonstrated the wealth and artistic sophistication of medieval German civilization. The Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral, the largest relic ever made, required the skills of dozens of craftsmen working over many years. Its golden figures, its enamel decorations, its precious gems created a work of art that was also a theological statement. Secular art was emerging alongside religious art, castle fresco, tournament armor, illuminated law codes, decorated household objects, all showed that artistic patronage was extending beyond the church to the nobility and the wealthy merchant class. Picture a great pyramid built not of stone but of people. At the apex sits the emperor, theoretically commanding all below. Beneath him, the dukes and great princes who ruled the major territories. Below them, the counts and lesser nobles who control smaller regions. At the base, the vast mass of peasants who work the land that supports everyone above. This feudal pyramid wasn't rigid. People could rise and fall within it. A successful knight might be granted land by his lord. A skilled administrator might be ennobled for his services. A merchant's daughter might marry into the nobility, but the basic structure provided stability and order in a world that often lacked both. The memorial system organized rural life around the lord's estate. The manor house, usually a fortified structure, stood at the center of a complex economic unit. Around it clustered the peasant villages, the parish church, the mill, the workshop, the fields that supported the entire community. Peasant life followed rhythms older than Christianity. Spring plowing, summer cultivation, autumn harvest, winter rest. The agricultural calendar determined when people worked, when they celebrated, when they married, when they died. The church provided new meanings for ancient ceremonies, but the underlying patterns remained unchanged. The three-field system revolutionized agricultural productivity. Instead of leaving half the land fallow each year, farmers could now keep 2/3 in production. One field for spring crops, like oats and barley. One field for autumn crops, like wheat and rye. One field resting to restore its fertility. But the real revolution was the emergence of a money economy. For centuries, most transactions had been conducted through barter or service. Now coins were becoming common, even in rural areas. Peasants sold their surplus crops for silver. Lords collected rents in cash rather than kind. Women's roles varied dramatically by social class. Noble ladies could inherit land, rule territories in their husband's absence, and wield considerable political influence. Nuns could achieve positions of authority that were denied to their secular sisters. Peasant women worked alongside their menfolk in fields and workshops. Urban wives often ran family businesses when their husbands traveled. But all women, regardless of class, were legally subordinate to male authority. They couldn't inherit equally with their brothers. They couldn't testify in court in many circumstances. They couldn't choose their own husbands without family approval. The Virgin Mary might be venerated as Queen of Heaven, but earthly women lived under earthly restrictions. The rise of cities created new social possibilities. Urban communities needed skilled craftsmen, merchants, lawyers, physicians, teachers. These occupations offered paths to prosperity that didn't depend on noble birth or church office. Guild membership became the key to urban success. Master craftsmen controlled their trades through elaborate regulations that protected quality standards and limited competition. Apprentices learned their trades through years of unpaid service. Journeymen traveled from city to city, perfecting their skills and hoping to earn master status. Dawn breaks over a German village around 1300. Smoke rises from thatched roofs. Church bells call the faithful to morning prayers. In the fields beyond the houses, peasants begin another day of labor that has changed little since their great-grandfathers worked this same soil. Village life followed patterns established centuries earlier. Houses clustered around the parish church in the Lord's manor. Gardens provided vegetables and herbs for daily meals. Common fields were divided into strips, each family working its allotted share according to ancient custom. The three-field system required careful coordination. The village assembly had to decide when to plant, what crops to grow, when to harvest. Individual initiative was less important than community cooperation. Everyone's welfare depended on everyone else's labor. Agricultural innovations were spreading slowly but steadily. The heavy plow, pulled by teams of oxen or horses, could break ground that earlier implements couldn't touch. The horse collar, imported from China, through the Islamic world allowed horses to pull heavier loads without strangling themselves. Windmills and watermills were relieving peasants of the back-breaking labor of grinding grain by hand. These weren't just technological improvements. They were economic revolutions that freed human energy for other pursuits, but peasant obligations remained heavy. Labor service required several days each week working the Lord's domain land. Rent took a significant portion of each harvest. Church tithes demanded another tenth of all production. Fees were required for using the Lord's mill, bake oven, and wine press. The peasant calendar mixed Christian observances with much older traditions. Christmas coincided with the winter solstice. Easter merged with spring fertility rites. Harvest festivals became church celebrations. The old gods were forgotten, but their festivals lived on in new forms. Popular religious practices often confused educated clergy. Peasants prayed to saints for good weather and healthy livestock. They carried blessed herbs to protect their animals from disease. They observed elaborate rituals at planting and harvest time. Their Christianity was deeply practical, focused on immediate needs rather than abstract theology. Folk beliefs preserved ancient wisdom about agriculture, medicine, and weather prediction. Grandmothers taught their granddaughters which herbs could cure headaches and which could prevent pregnancy. Fathers passed on to their sons the subtle signs that indicated when to plant and when to harvest. The manor court dispensed justice according to local custom. Disputes over property boundaries, inheritance rights, and marriage contracts were settled by assemblies of peasant jurors who knew local conditions intimately. Written law was giving way to customary law, but slowly and incompletely. Market days brought excitement to the rural world. Peddlers carried news along with their goods. Minstrels sang songs of distant places. Merchants offered manufactured items that local craftsmen couldn't produce. For a few hours, the village was connected to the wider world beyond its boundaries. The Black Death, when it came in the 14th century, would transform this ancient world forever. But for now, in the quiet centuries before the Great Plague, peasant life continued its eternal rhythm. Birth, growth, labor, death. The human cycle that had sustained civilization since the beginning of agriculture. and would continue long after the last castle had crumbled into ruins. The medieval German world was coming to an end, though its inhabitants couldn't know it. New forces were stirring that would reshape everything. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of capitalism, the emergence of modern states. But for now, in village and castle, monastery and cathedral, the old world continued its stately dance toward an uncertain future. The year 1315 brought rain that wouldn't stop. Grey clouds hung over Europe like a curse. Fields that should have been golden with ripening grain turned into muddy lakes. The medieval warm period, which had blessed Europe with mild winters and abundant harvest for 3 centuries, was coming to an end. Picture the desperation of a German farmer watching his crops rot in waterlogged soil. His grandfather had told stories of harsh winters and failed harvests, but those seemed like distant memories. For generations, the climate had been kind. Populations had grown. New lands had been cleared and settled. Now the weather itself seemed to have turned against humanity. The Great Famine of 1315 and 1322 struck Europe like a divine punishment. Chroniclers wrote of people eating bark, grass, and things too horrible to mention. In Germany, the price of grain rose 10 times its normal level. Families sold their children into slavery rather than watch them starve. Villages that had flourished for centuries simply disappeared as their inhabitants died or fled. The social consequences rippled through every level of society. Peasants abandoned their holdings and took to the roads as beggars. Lords found their revenues collapsing as rents went uncollected. Monasteries, which had always cared for the poor, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of desperate souls seeking help. Migration patterns that had remained stable for generations suddenly shifted. People fled from marginal lands to areas that seemed more secure. Mountain settlements were abandoned as families sought refuge in valley towns. Forest clearings reverted to wilderness as their cultivators died or moved away. The Little Ice Age had begun, though nobody understood the term yet. What they experienced was immediate and terrifying. Summers too cold for crops to ripen, winters too harsh for livestock to survive, springs that came too late and autumns that arrived too early. Feudal relationships already strained by the changes of the previous century buckled under the pressure. When peasants couldn't pay their rents, lords couldn't meet their own obligations to their superiors. The whole careful structure of medieval society based on agricultural surplus threatened to collapse. Some regions adapted better than others. The Hanseatic cities, with their grain imports from Eastern Europe, weathered the crisis more successfully than inland areas. The Alpine regions, with their diverse economy of farming, harung, and trade, proved more resilient than the great grain-growing plains. But everywhere the famine marked a turning point. The optimism of the High Middle Ages was giving way to something darker. The population growth that had characterized the previous centuries slowed, then reversed. The great age of cathedral building and territorial expansion was ending. Europe was about to face an even greater catastrophe. The ships that docked at German ports in 1347 brought more than exotic goods from the east. They carried invisible passengers, fleas infected with the deadliest plague in human history. The Black Death struck Germany like lightning. Cities that had bustled with activity fell silent within weeks. Entire families died in their homes. Their bodies discovered only when neighbors broke down doors to investigate the stench. Chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe the horror. In Cologne, the great cathedral stood unfinished as its builders lay dead or dying. In Nuremberg, workshops that had produced the finest crafts in Europe stood empty. In Hamburg, Ships rotted at their moorings because no one survived to unload them. The numbers tell only part of the story. 1/3 of Germany's population died between 1347 and 1351. In some regions, half the people perished. Villages that had existed since Charlemagne's time were wiped off the map entirely. Entire bloodlines, noble and common alike, simply ceased to exist. But the plague didn't kill democratically. It struck hardest at the poor, who lived in crowded conditions with inadequate nutrition. The wealthy could flee to country estates or isolated castles. The urban poor had nowhere to run. They died in cellars and tenements, while the rich survived in their well-provisioned retreats. Social upheaval followed demographic catastrophe like thunder follows lightning. The survivors suddenly found themselves in a world turned upside down. Peasants who had accepted their lowly status for generations now saw opportunity in the chaos. If lords needed workers, workers could demand better terms. The peasant revolts that erupted across Germany weren't just economic protests. They were revolutionary challenges to the entire social order. In Swabia, peasant armies destroyed castles and murdered nobles. In Thuringia, serfs burned manor houses and declared their freedom. The Peasants' War was still a century in the future, but its roots lay in the social disruption caused by the plague. Urban unrest took different forms, but was equally threatening to established authority. Craftsmen demanded representation in city governments that had been dominated by merchant patricians. Workers organized strikes against masters who tried to maintain pre-plague wage levels. The old guild system, which had provided stability for generations, cracked under the pressure of sudden change. But perhaps the darkest consequence of the plague was the persecution of minorities. Faced with inexplicable catastrophe, people sought scapegoats. Jews who had lived peacefully in German cities for centuries suddenly found themselves accused of poisoning wells and spreading disease. The pogroms that followed were horrific even by medieval standards. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the city cemetery. In Mainz, the entire Jewish quarter was destroyed and its inhabitants murdered. In dozens of smaller towns, Jewish communities that had existed for generations were wiped out overnight. The persecution wasn't limited to Jews, lepers, beggars, foreigners. Anyone who seemed different became a target. The plague had revealed something ugly in human nature, the tendency to blame others for disasters beyond anyone's control. Yet, the plague also revealed human resilience and compassion. Chroniclers recorded stories of priests who continued to minister to the dying even as their own death approached. Physicians who remained at their posts despite the obvious futility of their efforts. Ordinary people who cared for orphaned children and buried the dead when no one else would do it. When the plague finally burned itself out, the survivors faced a transformed world. Labor was scarce and therefore valuable. Land was abundant and therefore cheap. Traditional authorities had lost much of their legitimacy. The stage was set for changes that would reshape European civilization. The church that had provided stability and meaning for 1,000 years suddenly seemed as fragile as everything else. When the Black Death struck, prayers had proved useless. When famine ravaged the countryside, divine intervention had failed to materialize. Many began to question whether God still cared about his people. The Western Schism deepened the crisis of faith. From 1378 to 1417, 2 and sometimes 3 men claimed to be the true pope. Each had his supporters. Each excommunicated the others. Each claimed to be the only path to salvation. How could ordinary believers know which one to follow? German churches found themselves caught in the middle of this ecclesiastical civil war. Some supported the Roman Pope, others the Avignon Pope, still others the peasant Pope. Bishops appointed by one claimant found their authority challenged by rivals, appointed by another. The unity of Christendom, which had seemed so solid during the High Middle Ages, lay in ruins. But crisis breeds innovation. In the Rhe Valley, a new form of spirituality was emerging that would profoundly influence Christian thought. The German mystics offered a direct path to God that bypassed the institutional church entirely. Meister Eckhart, the Dominican preacher and theologian, taught that the human soul could achieve union with the divine through contemplation and detachment. His sermons, delivered in German rather than Latin, reached audiences who had never encountered such sophisticated theology. Eckhart's message was both comforting and dangerous. Comforting because it promised that anyone could find God through prayer and meditation. Dangerous because it seemed to make priests, bishops, and even popes unnecessary. The church hierarchy condemned some of his teachings, but his influence continued to spread. Johannes Tauer and Hinrich Susart's disciples developed his ideas in different directions. Thaler emphasized the practical aspects of mystical experience, how ordinary people could incorporate contemplative practices into their daily lives. Sus explored the emotional dimensions of mystical union, creating a spirituality that appealed to women as well as men. The Devotio Moana, which emerged in the Netherlands and spread into Germany, represented another approach to religious reform. The Brothers of the Common Life, founded by Gerard Groot, created communities of lay people and clergy who lived simply, worked honestly, and devoted themselves to prayer and study. These weren't monks in the traditional sense. They took no permanent vows. They owned property. They engaged in business. But they tried to live according to Christian principles in ways that seemed more authentic than the elaborate ceremonies and worldly ambitions of the official church. The brothers' schools became famous throughout Northern Europe. They emphasized practical piety over theological speculation. Their students included many who would later become leaders of the Protestant Reformation. Thomas Ampus, who wrote The Imitation of Christ, was trained in their tradition. Criticism of clerical corruption became increasingly bold and widespread. Preachers denounced priests who kept concubines. Scholars attacked bishops who sold church offices to the highest bidder. Lay people organized to demand reform of monasteries that had grown wealthy and lax. The conciliar movement attempted to reform the church from within. The Council of Constance 1414 to 1418 ended the Western Schism by deposing all rival popes and electing Martin Fist, but it also declared that church councils had authority over popes, a revolutionary doctrine that threatened the entire structure of ecclesiastical government. German participants in the council, influenced by the ideas emerging from the new universities, pushed for even more radical reforms. They wanted to limit papal taxation, allow clerical marriage, and give lay people a greater role in church governance. Most of these proposals were rejected, but they planted seeds that would bear fruit in the next century. While the Holy Roman Empire grew weaker, its component parts grew stronger. The great duchies that had once been merely administrative units were becoming independent states in all but name. Bavaria, under the Wittelsbach dynasty, exemplified this transformation. The dukes of Bavaria governed their territory with minimal reference to imperial authority. They collected taxes, administered justice, controlled the church, and conducted foreign policy as if they were sovereign rulers. The division of Bavaria among multiple branches of the Wittelsbach family created a complex political landscape. Bavaria Munich, Bavaria Landshut, Bavaria Engelstadt, and Bavaria Straubing each pursued their own interests while maintaining nominal unity. The result was a sophisticated balance of power within a single duchy. Saxony followed a different path under the Wettin family. The Wettins used their control of silver mines to build a territorial state that rivaled any in Europe. Their court at Dresden became a center of learning and artistic achievement. Their lands in Thuringia and Meissen provided the foundation for what would eventually become the Kingdom of Saxony. Brandenburg, under the Hohenzollern dynasty, began its long transformation from an insignificant march to a major European power. The Hohen combined military efficiency with administrative competence. They drained marshes, founded cities, and encouraged immigration from other parts of Germany. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, were building an empire that transcended German boundaries entirely. Through marriage and inheritance, they acquired Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. Through diplomacy and warfare, they gained influence in Italy and the Netherlands. Rudolf IV of Austria, called the founder, established the pattern that would make the Habsburgs the dominant force in Central Europe. He founded the University of Vienna, rebuilt St. Stephen's Cathedral, and created an administrative system that could govern diverse territories with different languages and customs. The acquisition of Bohemia brought the Habsburgs immense wealth from the silver mines of Kutna Hora. It also brought them into conflict with powerful Bohemian nobles who had no intention of submitting to Austrian authority. The Hussite Wars of the 15th century would test Habsburg power severely. Hungary's inclusion in the Habsburg system created a buffer against Ottoman expansion, while adding another complex ethnic and religious element to the growing empire. Hungarian nobles maintained their traditional privileges while accepting Habsburg overlordship, an arrangement that satisfied neither side completely. But not all territories accepted the trend towards centralization. The Swiss Confederation emerged from the collapse of Habsburg power in their original homeland. The forest cantons of Uri Schwisch and Unwalden formed a defensive alliance that gradually expanded to include cities like Zurich and Bern. The Battle of Morgarten 1315 saw Swiss infantry defeat Habsburg cavalry in a victory that shocked the military establishment of Europe. The Battle of Siesch 1386 confirmed that well-organized commoners could defeat noble warriors. Swiss independence was secured not through diplomacy but through military innovation. Urban leagues also challenged traditional authority structures. The Swabian League united cities and minor nobles against the power of great princes. The Rhenish League attempted to create a confederation of free cities along the Rhine. These experiments and federal government provided alternatives to both imperial centralization and territorial fragmentation. The commercial revolution that began in the Italian cities spread northward into Germany with transforming force. New methods of doing business, new forms of credit, new approaches to investment were reshaping economic life. Banking, once the monopoly of Italian firms, found German practitioners who adapted Mediterranean techniques to northern European conditions. The Fugger family of Augsburg became the wealthiest bankers in Europe. Their loans to emperors and kings gave them political influence that rivaled traditional nobility. Jacob Fugger, called the Rich, built a financial empire that stretched from Lisbon to Budapest. His innovations in accounting, credit, and international exchange created the foundation for modern capitalism. His palace in Augsburg rivaled the residences of princes. The Welser family competed with the Fuggers for dominance in international finance. They funded trading expeditions to the Americas, established banks in major European cities, and even governed territories in Venezuela. Their rise from humble beginnings to princely wealth demonstrated the new possibilities created by commercial success. Joint stock companies pioneered in Italy found application in German mining ventures. The silver mines of Saxony and Bohemia required investments too large for individual entrepreneurs. Shared ownership allowed multiple investors to pool their resources while limiting their risks. The Hanseatic League reached its peak during this period. From London to Novgorod, from Bergen to Bruges, Hanseatic merchants dominated northern European trade. Their ships carried grain, timber, furs, and manufactured goods across the Baltic and North Seas. Lübeck, the unofficial capital of the Hanseatic League, became one of the richest cities in Europe. Its merchants lived like princes, building elaborate churches and guild halls that proclaimed their wealth and power. The city's law code, the Lübeck Law, was adopted by dozens of other cities across Eastern Europe. The mining boom in Saxony and Bohemia produced unprecedented quantities of silver. New techniques for extracting ore from deep mines made previously unworkable deposits profitable. The silver that flowed from these mines financed everything from cathedral construction to international warfare. But the most revolutionary technological innovation was the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's workshop in mind produced the first printed Bible around 1455. The implications of this achievement were staggering. Books which had been luxury items available only to the wealthy and the church suddenly became affordable to middle-class readers. Ideas that had once spread slowly through manuscript copying could now be disseminated rapidly across vast distances. The printing press would prove to be the most important invention since the wheel. German printers quickly adopted and improved Gutenberg's techniques. Nuremberg, Augsburg, Cologne, and Strasbourg became major centers of book production. By 1500 more books had been printed in Germany than in the rest of Europe combined. The economic implications were enormous. A new industry emerged overnight, employing typesetters, papermakers, bookbinders, and distributors. Publishing houses became international businesses that competed for markets across Europe. But the cultural implications were even more significant. Knowledge, which had been the monopoly of educated elite, was becoming democratized. Lay people could now read the Bible in their own language. Scholars could study classical texts without traveling to distant libraries. Revolutionary ideas could spread faster than any authority could suppress them. The Renaissance, which had transformed Italian intellectual life, crossed the Alps and found eager reception in German universities and courts. But this wasn't simple imitation of Italian models. German humanists created their own synthesis of classical learning and Christian tradition. Johannes Royalen, the father of German humanism, mastered Hebrew and Greek in addition to Latin. His defense of Hebrew literature against Christian critics who wanted to destroy Jewish books marked an important step toward religious tolerance and scholarly freedom. Roshan's nephew, Philip Melanchthon, would become one of the most important figures in the Protestant Reformation. But his early training in humanist methods influenced his approach to religious reform. The Reformation would be as much an intellectual movement as a religious one. The Sidurus Erasmus, though Dutch by birth, spent much of his career in German cities. His satirical works, especially the praise of folly, exposed the absurdities of medieval scholasticism and clerical corruption. His Greek New Testament provided the textual foundation for Protestant theology. The University of Vienna became a major center of humanist learning. Its faculty included scholars from across Europe who brought new approaches to classical studies, natural philosophy, and theology. Students came from as far away as Poland and Hungary to study with masters who represented the cutting edge of Renaissance scholarship. Vernacular literature began to challenge Latin's dominance in serious writing. Hans Sachs in Nuremberg wrote plays and poems in German that rivaled the best Latin works. Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools became a bestseller that was translated into multiple languages. The development of vernacular literature wasn't just a cultural phenomenon. It was a political one. When scholars wrote in German rather than Latin, they were appealing to audiences that had been excluded from learned discourse. They were democratizing knowledge in ways that would have profound political consequences. Scientific advances stimulated by contact with Islamic and Byzantine. Learning began to challenge medieval assumptions about the natural world. Gog, Purbach, and Johannes Regiomontanus, working in Vienna, made astronomical observations that would influence Copernicus. Medical knowledge advanced through the translation of Arabic texts and the establishment of medical schools that emphasized practical training alongside theoretical learning. The University of Vienna's medical faculty became famous for its surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge. Natural philosophy, the medieval term for what we would call science, began to separate itself from theology. Scholars still believed that God had created the natural world, but they increasingly argued that this world could be understood through observation and reason, rather than just through scriptural authority. The printing press accelerated all these developments by making scholarly works widely available. Ideas that had once been confined to small circles of academics could now reach educated readers across Europe. The pace of intellectual change accelerated dramatically. Maximilian II, who ruled from 1493 to 1519, embodied the contradictions of his age, called the Last Knight. He romanticized the chaotic ideals of the medieval past while mastering the new political techniques that would define the early modern period. Maximilian's marriage to Mary of Burgundy brought the rich Netherlands provinces into the Habsburg system. This wasn't just a dynastic alliance. It was the foundation of Habsburg world power. The wealth of Flemish cities would finance Habsburg ambitions for the next 2 centuries. The Bindian inheritance also brought conflict with France. The French kings had their own claims to Burgundian territories. The Italian wars, which would consume European energies for decades, began as a dispute over Burgundian succession. Maximilian's marriage diplomacy was masterful and fairy. His son Philippe married Joanna of Castile, bringing Spain into the Habsburg orbit. His daughter Margaret married the heir to the French throne, though that marriage was later in. His grandchildren were positioned to inherit half of Europe. The League of Camera, formed in 1508, showed how Habsburg power was reshaping European politics. Pope, Emperor, and King of France united against Venice, an alliance that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. The balance of power that had characterized medieval Europe was giving way to the great power politics of the early modern period. Maximilian's involvement in Italian politics revived imperial claims that had been dormant since the Stala period. But this wasn't an attempt to restore medieval empire. This was power politics based on dynastic inheritance and military strength, rather than theoretical claims to universal authority. The emperor's administrative reforms attempted to strengthen central authority within the Holy Roman Empire. The imperial chamber court provided a forum for resolving disputes between territorial princes. The common penny offered a new source of imperial revenue. The imperial diet became a more regular institution for coordinating policy. But these reforms only highlighted the empire's fundamental weakness. The territorial princes had grown too powerful to be controlled by imperial institutions. The cities had developed their own networks of cooperation that bypassed imperial authority. The empire was becoming a confederation rather than a unified state. Maximilian understood that Habsburg power would depend on resources outside the traditional empire. The Spanish inheritance would prove more valuable than the German crown. The Netherlands would provide more revenue than all the German territories combined. The future lay not in reviving imperial authority, but in building a new kind of power based on dynastic possessions rather than feudal relationships. The Diet of Worms in 1495 represented the last serious attempt to reform the Holy Roman Empire from within. The assembled princes, bishops, and city representatives understood that something fundamental had to change. The empire was fragmenting. Imperial authority was collapsing, and foreign powers were treating German territories as pawns in their own games. Maximilian arrived at Worms with ambitious plans for constitutional reform. He wanted to create new institutions that could govern the empire more effectively. He needed new sources of revenue that could support imperial policy. Most importantly, he sought to balance the competing demands of central authority and regional autonomy that had torn the empire apart for centuries. The imperial chamber court, established by the Diet, represented genuine innovation in medieval governance. This wasn't just another royal court dispensing the emperor's personal justice. This was an independent tribunal staffed by professional lawyers who would apply written law consistently across the empire. The court's jurisdiction included disputes between territorial princes, conflicts between cities and their neighbors, and appeals from local courts that had failed to provide justice. For the first time since the Caroling period, ordinary subjects of the empire had access to impartial justice that didn't depend on local political influence. Legal reform accompanied institutional innovation. Roman law, which had been studied in universities for centuries, finally began to replace the bewildering variety of local customs that governed different regions. This wasn't cultural imperialism. This was practical necessity. A common legal framework was essential for economic development and political stability. The common penny, the empire's first general tax, broke new ground in imperial finance. Instead of depending on feudal obligations and voluntary contributions, the emperor could now collect regular revenue from all his subjects. The amounts were small, but the principle was revolutionary. Yet even these modest reforms faced fierce resistance. The territorial princes feared any strengthening of central authority. The cities worried that imperial taxation would undermine their economic autonomy. The clergy objected to secular control over ecclesiastical revenues. The attempt to strengthen central authority revealed the empire's fundamental problem. Germany had become too diverse, too decentralized, to set in its regional patterns to be governed effectively from a single center. The reforms of 1495 were too little, too late. The Ottoman advance into Central Europe transformed German political consciousness in ways that would influence European development for centuries. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had shocked Christendom. The conquest of Serbia, Bosnia, and much of Hungary brought Muslim armies to within striking distance of Vienna. The Battle of Mohatz in 1526 would destroy the Hungarian kingdom and leave Austria exposed to Ottoman attack. But even in the late 15th century, the Turkish threat was reshaping imperial politics and German identity. Hungarian campaigns became annual affairs that drained imperial resources while providing little lasting security. The Ottomans would advance during the campaigning season, besieging fortresses and collecting tribute. The imperial army would respond, sometimes recapturing lost territory, more often simply limiting Ottoman gains. These campaigns weren't just military expeditions. They were crusades that appealed to religious sentiment that went back to the 11th century. German knights who fought against the Turks believed they were defending Christian civilization against Islamic conquest. The role of the German nobility in this new crusading movement was complex. Many genuinely believed they were serving God by fighting Muslims. Others saw Turkish wars as opportunities for plunder and advancement. Still others resented being asked to fight distant campaigns, while their own territories needed defense. Imperial politics were transformed by the constant need for military funding. The emperor couldn't fight the Turks without money from the German princes. The princes wouldn't provide money without concessions to their own authority. The result was a gradual transfer of power from the center to the periphery. The taxation required for Turkish wars accustomed German subjects to levels of fiscal extraction that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. The common penny was just the beginning. Special levies for fortress construction, cavalry recruitment, and artillery procurement became regular features of imperial finance. But the Turkish threat also provided opportunities for imperial leadership. An emperor who could successfully defend Christendom against Muslim conquest could claim moral authority that transcended the empire's constitutional weaknesses. The Ottoman advance created the external pressure that held the fragmenting empire together. The church that Martin Luther would challenge in 1517 was already in crisis. Popular piety had never been stronger, but institutional credibility had rarely been weaker. Ordinary Germans practiced their faith with passionate intensity, while questioning the authority of those who claimed to lead them. Religious practices multiplied dramatically during the 15th century. Pilgrimage sites attracted unprecedented numbers of visitors. Devotional books became bestsellers. Religious confraternities organized laypeople for prayer, charity, and mutual support. The appetite for religious experience seemed insatiable, but much of this religious enthusiasm was directed toward practices that bypassed clerical authority. Lay religious movements emphasized direct, personal relationship with God. Mystical traditions stressed inner experience over external ceremony. Popular piety often had more in common with pre-Christian folk religion than with official church teaching. The sale of indulgences, which would trigger Luther's protest, was just the most visible symptom of broader ecclesiastical corruption. Church offices were bought and sold like pieces of property. Bishops collected revenues from multiple sees while residing in none of them. Monasteries that should have been centers of spiritual life became comfortable retreats for younger sons of noble families. Popular criticism of clerical corruption had been building for generations. Satirical literature mocked ignorant priests and greedy bishops. Folk tales portrayed clergy as hypocrites who preached virtue while practicing vice. The moral authority that had sustained the medieval church was crumbling. Mystical movements offered alternatives to institutional religion that appealed to educated lay people. The followers of Meister Eckhart and Johannes Hauler believed they could achieve direct union with God through contemplation and prayer. They didn't need priests to mediate their relationship with the divine. The Devote of Madna provided practical models for religious reform. The Brethren of the Common Life showed that lay people could live holy lives without taking monastic vows. Their schools produced students who combined deep piety with practical competence. Lay religious enthusiasm sometimes took forms that worried church authorities. Prophetic movements proclaimed that the end times were approaching. Flagellant processions demonstrated extreme forms of penitential devotion. Popular preachers attracted crowds that rivaled those of bishops and abbots. The printing press was spreading religious ideas faster than any authority could control them. Devotional manuals, biblical commentaries, and mystical treatises reached audiences that had never encountered such sophisticated theology. The religious literacy of ordinary people was increasing dramatically. University theology was becoming increasingly complex and abstract, while popular religious needs remained immediate and practical. Scholastic debates about transubstantiation and papal authority seemed irrelevant to lay people who wanted guidance for daily life and assurance of salvation. The stage was set for religious revolution. All that was needed was a catalyst, a single event that would focus popular discontent and provide leadership for the reform movement that everyone sensed was coming. Columbus's voyage in 1492 seemed distant from German concerns, but its consequences would reshape European civilization. The discovery of America opened new trade routes, provided new sources of wealth, and challenged assumptions about geography and human society that had been accepted for centuries. German merchants quickly recognized the opportunities created by Atlantic exploration. The family of Augsburg financed expeditions to Venezuela. Hamburg shipbuilders constructed vessels for Portuguese and Spanish expeditions. Silver from American mines would eventually destabilize European currencies and transform international commerce. The impact on German economy was indirect but significant. Traditional trade routes through the Mediterranean lost importance as Atlantic routes developed. Italian cities that had dominated European commerce found themselves competing with Atlantic ports. The economic center of Europe was shifting northward. The printing press was revolutionizing the spread of ideas with consequences that nobody could foresee. Books that once required months to copy could now be produced in hundreds of copies within weeks. Ideas that had once spread slowly through scholarly correspondence could now reach mass audiences almost immediately. By 1500, printing presses operated in dozens of German cities. Nuremberg, Augsburg, Strasbourg, and Cologne had become major centers of book production. German printers had developed techniques that made their products competitive in markets across Europe. The democratization of the knowledge that printing enabled was already producing social tensions. When ordinary people could read the Bible in their own language, they might question interpretations provided by clerical authority. When secular books challenged religious teaching, traditional sources of truth came under scrutiny. Renaissance influences from Italy were transforming German intellectual life. Humanist scholars were applying classical learning to contemporary problems. Artists were experimenting with perspective and realism that broke from medieval traditions. Architects were incorporating classical elements into Gothic structures. But the German Renaissance wasn't simply imitation of Italian models. German humanists developed their own approaches to classical learning. German artists created syntheses of Northern and Southern European traditions. German architects evolved distinctive styles that reflected local conditions and preferences. Universities were expanding their curricula beyond traditional theology, law, and medicine. Natural philosophy, mathematics, and classical literature found places alongside medieval scholasticism. Students could now receive educations that prepared them for secular careers in government, commerce, and the professions. The preparation for religious revolution was evident to anyone who cared to look. Popular dissatisfaction with clerical corruption was widespread. Alternative forms of religious practice were multiplying. Intellectual criticism of church doctrine was becoming more systematic, and more public. Political conditions also favored religious change. The empire was too weak to enforce religious uniformity. Territorial princes valued their autonomy more than papal approval. Cities prized their independence and saw religious reform as another aspect of municipal self-government. The medieval world was dying, though its funeral hadn't yet been held. The Reformation, when it came, would provide the burial service for a civilization that had already expired. Martin Luther's protest in 1517 wouldn't create the crisis of medieval Christianity. It would simply reveal a crisis that had been building for generations. The 1,000 years that stretched from the fall of Rome to the rise of Luther had transformed a collection of Germanic tribes into the heart of European civilization. The Holy Roman Empire that emerged from this transformation wasn't the Roman Empire reborn despite its name. It was something entirely new, a synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Christian traditions that would influence Western development for centuries to come. The First Reich, as later German nationalists would call it, established patterns of governance that emphasized federalism over centralization. Local autonomy over imperial authority, negotiated consent over absolute rule. The Golden Bull of 1356 created a constitutional framework that balanced competing interests while maintaining overall unity. German identity itself was a creation of the medieval period. The tribes that Tacitus had described, Saxons, Franks, Bavarians, Swabians, gradually developed a sense of common destiny that transcended their original differences. The German language that emerged from their various dialects became the vehicle for a literature that could compete with any in Europe. Legal and institutional foundations laid during the medieval period would influence German development long after the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution. The principle that authority must be exercised according to law, not arbitrary will, became deeply embedded in German political culture. The idea that different regions could maintain their distinctive characteristics while participating in a larger political structure provided the foundation for modern federalism. Cultural and artistic achievements of the medieval period established Germany's place in European civilization. Gothic cathedrals that rose in Cologne and Strasbourg rivaled anything built in France or England. Minnesänger who sang at medieval courts created literary traditions that influenced European poetry for centuries. Scholars working in German universities preserved and transmitted the learning that would fuel the Renaissance and Reformation. Religious traditions that developed during the medieval period prepared the ground for both Catholic renewal and Protestant Reformation. German mysticism provided alternatives to institutional religion that would appeal to both reforming Catholics and protesting Protestants. Popular piety that flourished in late medieval Germany created audiences for religious change that went far beyond clerical circles. Economic structures that emerged during the medieval period established patterns of trade and finance that would make Germany a major player in European commerce. The Hanseatic League demonstrated that German merchants could compete successfully with Italian and Flemish rivals. Mining operations in Saxony and Bohemia provided precedents for the industrial development that would come in later centuries. Constitutional experiments conducted within the Holy Roman Empire influenced political development across Europe. The electoral system created by the Golden Bull provided an alternative to hereditary monarchy. The federal structure that balanced central authority with regional autonomy offered a model for governing diverse populations with different traditions and interests. But perhaps the most important legacy of medieval Germany was the demonstration that political unity didn't require cultural uniformity, that effective government could accommodate regional differences. That authority could be exercised through consent rather than coercion. These weren't modern democratic ideas, but they contained the seeds from which democratic institutions would eventually grow. The dreams and struggles of medieval generations created the foundation stones of modern Germany. The conflicts between emperor and pope, between central authority and regional autonomy, between tradition and innovation, worked themselves out over centuries through processes of negotiation, compromise, and gradual adaptation that avoided the revolutionary upheavals that characterized other parts of Europe. As the myth settles over this thousand-year story, we can see the continuous thread of German civilization stretching from tribal chieftains to Holy Roman emperors, from pagan forests to Gothic cathedrals, from oral traditions to printed books. Each generation built upon the achievements of its predecessors, while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The timeless human story of ambition, faith, and endurance that unfolded in medieval Germany continues to resonate today. The people who cleared forests and built cities, who created art and preserved learning, who fought wars and made peace, who struggled with questions of faith and power and justice, established patterns of thought and behavior that continue to influence how Germans understand themselves and their place in the world. Medieval Germany was the crucible in which modern European civilization was forged. Its legacy lives on in the institutions, traditions, and ideas that continue to shape not only Germany, but all of Western civilization. The knights have laid down their swords. The emperors have closed their eyes to eternal rest. But their achievements endure in the continuing story of human progress and possibility. The gentle rhythm of history flows on like a great river, carrying forward the memories and dreams of all who have walked this earth before us, inviting us to add our own chapter to the never-ending story of human civilization. In the silence of the night, we can still hear the echo of medieval bells across the valleys of time, calling us to remember those who came before and to honor their legacy through our own lives and choices. Sleep well and dream of castles rising in the morning mist, of cathedrals reaching toward heaven, of the noble struggles of our ancestors who built the world we have inherited. Their story is our story. Their dreams are our dreams. Their legacy is our responsibility. The medieval world may have ended, but its spirit lives on in all of us who carry forward the torch of human civilization into an uncertain but hopeful future.